On the charge sheet of human history, few things create such an indelible stain as slavery.
The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse. Nothing.
Yet few histories are more important for us to understand.
It's power to know what happened to you in the past. Because if you don't know what happened to you in the past, you can't stop it from happening again.
In this series, many well-known faces with a direct and often surprising link to this thousand-year story are embarking on journeys to different corners of the globe. They'll uncover the truth about their past and tell the story of the oppression and exploitation of one human being by another.
It beggars belief, really. How do you make that transition? How do you go through that trauma and that adversity?
With expert knowledge from across continents, their journeys will be complemented by descendants, celebrities, and historians to tell the bigger story of the enslaved peoples of the world.
The enslavement of Africans changed our language. It changed what we eat, what we wear, what we drink, and created a force that still divides us today.
Yet slavery also inspired resistance and rebellion. From a brave but doomed uprising in Jamaica.
I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm proud to be who I am, and I'm proud where I come from and who I come from.
To a long overdue reckoning in our own lifetime.
Black Lives Matter!
This is the thousand-year story of how slavery stained our past and shaped the modern world. In this episode, actors David Harewood and Hugh Quashie explore opposite sides of the Atlantic slave trade. It saw an estimated 12 million Africans transported across the ocean and sold into a life of slavery. David travels to Barbados, where he uncovers the reality of Britain's connections with the enslavement and trading of human beings.
White supremacy is an English invention that was franchised to several different countries.
While Hugh travels to Ghana and discovers how two of his ancestors met very different fates.
One benefits from the European intervention, and the other ends up as a slave.
David Harewood starred in movies like Blood Diamond and played CIA Director of Counterterrorism David Estes in the hit TV show Homeland. He was born and grew up in Birmingham after his parents emigrated from Barbados to the UK. He's come here to try to find out more about his personal history.
I know what part of Barbados my mother was from, but there's still so much that I don't know. There's still so much about my past that I don't understand. There's still so many pieces of the jigsaw that are still missing.
The story of this island is bound up with the history of slavery. David knows it must be part of his heritage, but he was never taught anything about it in school.
It's quite extraordinary that I was never at any point in my educational history taught any of this. This is not on the curriculum anywhere. And in England, it is a particularly buried part of history.
I wasn't taught anything about slavery. It wasn't until I developed an interest in my past myself that I went to Dudley Library to find books about slavery, and there were books there, but we just weren't being taught it in school.
Everyone needs to know. You need to be able to talk about it and not feel that it's just too much shame for the British. No, let's find out what happened.
As well as it making me upset, it also makes me angry that there has just been no discussion about it. My sense of displacement erased. A sense of a dislocated identity erased.
To leave the story of slavery out of the histories that we teach in school is to lie by omission and make it more difficult for us to know each other.
By the middle of the 17th century, a small island the size of the Isle of Wight became the most profitable of all of England's colonies and a thriving hub of trade.
What's the driver of all of that trade? Sugar. Sugar. And what did that require? Clearing land, creating profitable crop systems.
But while the lucrative plantations were owned by British settlers, the back-breaking labor was done by enslaved Africans. At Bridgetown Harbour, where the slave ships first made landfall, David is meeting Professor Pedro Welsh. He teaches history at the University of the West Indies.
So they would bring African slaves here.
Yes. A ship would arrive. Remember, this might be 2 months of travel under the most horrendous conditions. They would land in this area, and they're crying. But this is land, at least.
At last, we came in sight of the island of Barbados. As the vessel drew nearer, we plainly saw the harbor and other ships of different kinds and sizes, and we were soon anchored amongst them. We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard, where we were pent up all together like so many sheep in a fold, without regard for sex or age.
Now comes the worst part of their lives. It's pretty horrendous. The sale of these enslaved persons require that they be in tip-top condition. They're going to be inspected by a would-be buyer. Females are going to have their genitals probed. Men are going to have their testicles looked at. They will be oiled and made to appear a little more presentable. At the song of a gong, don't. People rush to get the best. As far as the English settlers were concerned, once you were of African origin, you were property.
In this manner, without scruple, our relations and friends separated. Most of them never to see each other again.
Can't help but think of all those ships arriving with millions of Africans, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, children, and just being chucked into some small holding and people grabbing your sister and brothers and selling them to complete strangers. If you think about all of that trauma, it plays a part in my own sense of the dislocation of my identity. Who am I? Where do I come from?
Next, Hugh Quashie discovers the trauma experienced by enslaved Africans before they cross the Atlantic.
I'm not sure if it's possible to be a black man in Britain, in the USA, in Africa, and not be angry.
Many of the enslaved who worked on the sugar plantations in Barbados were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean from the coast of West Africa. Hugh Kwashi is a British Ghanaian actor and Hollywood star. He is returning to Ghana's capital, Accra, the city he left as a child. He's here to find out more about the brutal history of the slave trade. After he arrived in England, Hugh was sent to expensive private schools. But like David, he never learned much about slavery.
If you were taught anything, it was about how William Wilberforce worked tirelessly to end the slave trade. The history of slavery is, of course, a complicated one, but I didn't hear about it while I was learning about the Stuarts and Henry VIII and Florence Nightingale.
The Portuguese first established a presence here with the blessing of the Catholic Church in the 15th century.
The Catholic Church divides the world in half. They say that Spain gets to colonize the Western Atlantic world, and Portugal gets to trade along the western coast of Africa. That trade includes gold, ivory, and people.
But as the demand for enslaved Africans grew on the other side of the Atlantic, European powers competed for a piece of the action. The trade in humans boomed. Many millions of Africans were violently abducted from their homes. Not all of them made it as far as the coast.
What the slave traders wanted were young men and women. What they would do when they captured a village is they would kill those who had no value. They would kill the old and they would kill children. And they did that because those people would not survive the march to the coast. And they also did it to shock those who would.
Hugh is going to one of the country's most notorious slave sites, Osu Castle on the edge of Accra. The Danish built a stone fort here in the 17th century, naming it Christiansborg after their king. The Danes were small players in the burgeoning slave trade, yet between 1694 and 1803, they shipped 100,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Professor Rachel Engman, who is of Ghanaian and English descent, is conducting the first ever archaeological survey here.
The coast was like a shopping street. People are constantly coming in through the castle every day, and trades are happening right here.
These are cowrie shells.
So these are cowrie shells.
And these would have been used as currency.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But would it have been used to buy slaves?
Yes. For one enslaved person, you would maybe pay for that person using cowrie shells, using gold dust, using beads, an assortment of objects.
Rachel's research into the castle's history has unearthed shocking details of the conditions captive Africans were kept in here.
So the enslaved would have been in this room, they would have been standing, they would have urinated and defecated as they were standing because there was just no space.
So how many people?
You could have as many as up to 200 in this space.
So
and you
just ran out into the courtyard, all the crap.
And you'll find that in all the forts and castles along the coast, the floor is often raised higher than it was originally because it's the impacted skin, debris, filth, excrement that has raised the level of the floor.
Thus seeing my miserable companions and countrymen in this pitiful, distressed, and horrible situation, with all the brutish baseness and barbarity attending it, could not but fill my little mind with horror and indignation.
An estimated 12 million captive Africans would be shipped to the New World.
We know of that 12 million that around 1 million didn't survive. They died on board ships and their bodies were thrown overboard. There are stories that sharks learnt to follow the bloody paths of slave ships because for hundreds of years, bodies of over 1 million Africans were cast into the Atlantic Ocean.
I'm not sure if it's possible to be a black man or woman in the USA, in Britain, in Africa, and not be angry, knowing what we do about our history and knowing what we face in the present.
The Atlantic slave trade was conducted by Europeans, but was also underpinned by partnerships with local African leaders and merchants.
You know, I came here by boat today, and it was pretty clear, even in a boat with an outboard motor, it was difficult to land. Now, big ships couldn't come anywhere near as close, so they could only be fed by canoes going between the ships and the boat. So that meant that there had to be some cooperation, some sort of collusion with the local people living around the fort.
Slavery was already present in the world, and it was present in the continent of Africa, but it was different. Your status was not inherited by your children. You could find a way to move up in society. Now you see where there are Europeans trading with people of African descent, and they're putting people into this transatlantic slave trade, providing human capital for plantations. This form of slavery becomes racialized and commercialized.
On the other side of the Atlantic, David Harewood wants to find out more about how the enslaved were treated once they were sold to plantation owners. He's come to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. It houses documents that reveal how the British established a brutal model of slavery here that would soon be exported to other colonies.
Okay, so let's see if we can find them here for you.
Museum director Alessandra Cummings has looked out a book that details a draconian legal framework that was introduced in 1661, the Slave Code.
This volume makes it very clear that Africans were property, they were not individual human beings.
Right.
And the question might occur, why were laws needed? Well, within 20 years of the establishment of a sugar economy in the island, the enslaved population outnumbered in a very significant way the white plantocracy. And they felt the need for a certain level of control.
In 1644, before the sugar boom, the population of Barbados was estimated at 30,000. About 800 were of African descent, the rest mostly of English descent. But by 1660, just a year before the Slave Code was introduced, and with sugar production going into overdrive, there were 27,000 blacks to 26,000 whites.
I think we sometimes get slavery wrong. We focus on the harshness of the agricultural labor people were forced to do. We don't look at the slave codes that mandate forms of bodily mutilation, the slitting of people's cheeks, the cutting off of ears, the cutting off of toes.
If any Negro or slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to any Christian by striking or the like, such Negro or slave shall for his or her first offense be severely whipped by the constable. For his second offense of that nature, he shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in some parts of his face with a hot iron.
When they were really serious, they brought to the table this thing, this branding iron.
These were made in England?
They were made to order in England for the deliberate defacement of African individuals.
This would have been put in like hot coals, and literally you'd just be branded with it.
Exactly.
Presumably these are the initials of somebody's name.
Yeah. You are the property of the individual whose initials are branded, not on your shoulder, but on your face, on your forehead, on your cheek. This law, it's taken to Jamaica, it's taken to South Carolina, and it spreads all across the region.
But there were also rebellions, right? I mean, people did fight back.
Yes.
I know there's a very famous rebellion that took place on this island with a gentleman by the name of Bussa.
This rebellion started on Easter Sunday in 1816. The epicenter of the rebellion was Bailey's plantation because of a small group of individuals, one of whom happened to be African-born, not a Barbadian. So he understood the condition of freedom. And he orchestrated the signaling that activity should spread out to other plantations.
The Bussa Rebellion was the first of 3 major uprisings by the enslaved in the West Indies in the early 19th century. Bussa, who had been enslaved in West Africa, led some 400 rebels into battle against the British. But the rebellion was brutally crushed by the heavily armed colonial militia.
Reading that slave code, that was British, that was English. White supremacy is an English invention that was franchised to several different countries. The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse, nothing, because I'm not human. And I think that's fundamental to understand how that has informed racism.
Coming up, Hugh investigates a potential ancestor snatched from his home and transported to Europe.
He was taken as a very young child.
At the age of 4?
About the same age that I was when I left Ghana.
Okay.
And David makes a shocking discovery about his family tree.
So he was actually a slave?
Yes.
In Ghana, actor Hugh Kwashi is on the trail of an 18th century ancestor. When he was growing up, Hugh's father told him about Anton Wilhelm Amel, a Ghanaian he claimed to be descended from. He also gave him a paper about Amu's extraordinary life that still haunts him.
I didn't read it for a long time, but then I suddenly realized that actually this is an interesting story, and so I started reading it and started doing a bit of research. But yes, he wanted me to know about it.
The tiny fishing village of Shama lies 120 miles west of Ghana's capital, Accra. It's home to Fort San Sebastian, one of the oldest slave sites in the country. Built by the Portuguese in the 1520s, it was captured by the Dutch West India Company in 1642. It is here that Anton Wilhelm Amu is said to be buried.
Good, now something to interest you, right?
Hughes met up with historian Kwesi Essel Blankson from the Ghana Museum and Monuments Board.
Dr. Antonio Wilhelm Amu, the African.
Yeah. This is especially poignant for me because my father claimed him as an ancestor and gave me the name Anthony Amu. So my name is Hugh Anthony Kobna Amu. I've read a little bit about him. Born around 1703, taken a very young child.
At the age of 4?
About the same age that I was when I left Ghana.
Okay.
He was taken to the Netherlands and then on to Prussia.
Amu was transported to Europe by the Dutch West India Company as a child and given as a gift to the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel in modern-day Germany. He was one of the first Africans to attend a European university, becoming a professor of philosophy and publishing several important works. He returned to Ghana in the 1740s.
Also, and this I didn't know until very recently, he had a twin brother.
Oh, I see.
And the story is that the twin was seized illegally by a Dutch privateer and taken to Suriname.
I see.
So Amu came back, according to the legend. He demanded the return
of his brother,
or reparations. The Dutch got a bit alarmed, and my understanding was that he ended up.
That was the reason why they brought him
house
here.
Prisoner. It is especially poignant, isn't it, that within the same family,
two people experience slavery in different conditions.
One who becomes a very distinguished philosopher and academic in Europe, the other who stays and eventually ends up as a slave. Any African person is always going to be afraid of either finding an ancestor who was a slave or colluded in some way in the slave trade. I'm fortunate in having found ancestors who don't seem to have colluded, and if anything, argued strongly against it, in the case of Anton Wilhelm Amu. But I do wonder about the double-edged sword of Western civilization. On the one side, it did produce some great intellectual and academic distinction. On the other side, it devastated communities and impoverished them.
In Barbados, David Harewood is heading to a cluster of sugar plantations. He's hoping to find a direct link to his enslaved ancestors, once owned by the aristocratic Harewood family.
I'm finding out about my family, and it all helps to color in my identity. Just the history of my people. I'm sure that it could get a little emotional. It's a very dark chapter of British history.
Before 1834 and abolition, the enslaved were not included in usual records of births, marriages, and deaths. They were seen merely as property or chattel. David has never known the names of his enslaved ancestors.
They had 2 plantations just down from here.
But local genealogist Pat Stafford is expert at combing through little-known sources.
Let me just get out the copy.
I'm very excited about this.
She's drawn up a family tree for David based on some new findings.
I am aware of some of my family tree, but I gather you've been doing a little bit more work and you have maybe 1 or 2 more surprises for me. So,
Well, yes. I can just show you. Here's the family tree document. This is your grandfather, Herbert Harewood. And here's Benjamin William. And he was living on College Estate in St. John. And he was born in about 1840. And on his marriage certificate, Benjamin has told us that his father was called Richard Harewood.
Before great-great-grandfather Benjamin was born, it was the era of slavery, so there are no earlier records of births, marriages, and deaths. But there is one other place to look: the slave registers, introduced in 1817, 1 year after the Bussa Rebellion.
College Estate is immediately north. The next door plantations were Fortescue and Thickets, and they were owned by the Earl of Harewood.
oh, here we go.
And on their registers, we found a record for a lady called Betty. She had a son called Benjamin. And then we thought, well, where did Richard come from? The chances are that he's also on this register. And sure enough, who do we find?
Wow.
Richard, age 17 3/4 in 1834. These are the people that we believe are your 4 times great-grandparents.
Wow. So that's my dad's 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 dad.
That's right.
To connect David Harewood to Richard, 1817. I mean, that's just fantastic. So this guy was obviously working under slavery.
Yes,
This guy was.
absolutely.
That's what I hadn't got before. So he was. These guys were actually. He was actually a slave.
Yes. He was, and so was his wife.
That's
I know
incredible.
it's quite a sad thing to know, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thickets, where Richard and Betty were enslaved, is just a mile from Bailey's plantation, where Bussa's rebellion began in 1816. So David's forebears would have been acutely aware of the revolt and experienced the draconian crackdown that followed.
Just looking at that, it does make me proud, actually. Very proud. I can say to my children, these are your grandparents. This is what happened to them. This is what they survived. And I think it's a very good reminder that they really deserve to hold their heads up. And they really must continue the story. Because, you know, that's a proud line of strong people.
My mother used to say to me when I was growing up, live up to your ancestors' prayers. It's a beautiful way to describe that hope and that promise that those individuals who suffered so much and in their darkest moments of hoping for freedom, hope that their descendants could have so much more than they had.
Next, Hugh meets a philosopher who sheds more light on Amu's life and career.
He's just a beautiful counter-narrative to history, but also he allows us to see that the impossible is possible.
And David returns to England to confront a descendant of the family that owned his enslaved forebears.
Do you feel any guilt or shame about that?
Back in London, Hugh has been doing some more research into the man who could be his ancestor, Anton Wilhelm Amu. He's linking up with Dwight Lewis, who teaches philosophy at the University of Central Florida. He's done extensive research into Amu's life and work.
Hi, Dwight? Dwight, can you hear me?
I can. Hey, Hugh.
I'm curious as to what your interest in Amu is, and what he means to you.
You know, growing up here in the U.S., I went to school, and I wasn't granted the opportunity to read anyone that was black. I was yelling at my professor, saying, you know, we only have these 7 white guys that we keep focusing on, you know, we're the black figures in history. So my goal has been, to some extent, to change the narrative of what we think about black, especially in the 18th century. You know, we read people like David Hume, who just tell us, right, that black is, by definition, inferior intellectually. And Amu comes prior to them and shows that that's just not the case. And so for me, he's just a beautiful counter-narrative to history, but also he allows us to see that the impossible is possible.
Despite Amu's accomplishments, he chose to return to Africa in the 1740s. No one is sure why.
Do you think he maybe reached the limits of Western philosophy?
If I was speculating myself, I would say that the racial tensions had grown astronomically by the middle of the 18th century. This is the height of the slave trade. And so because of this, I actually think he goes home because being a Negro in Germany actually changed from the early 18th century to the middle of the 18th century. And I partly say this because we can just look at...
It's clear that the significance of Amu to Dwight is as a historical figure. For me, it's more personal, I guess. And I think over the years, I've come to feel a kind of affinity with the man. He came from the same part of Ghana as my father did. So it's possible that there is a line of direct descent, but in a way, it's not critical. The fact that he lived and he achieved things, that in itself is a source of pride to some extent, but it's also, it sets a precedent, it's an example. And it shows what can be done.
David has also returned to England. He has come to the seat of the Earl of Harewood, whose family once owned his forebears. The vast Palladian mansion is built on the profits of sugar and slavery.
The opulence, the grandeur, it's like a monument to white supremacy. What I don't see is the other side of the story.
He's here to meet the current Earl of Harewood, David Lascelles.
I didn't really sleep last night. I was thinking quite a lot about this meeting. I think the emotional toll of building up to it has left me pretty wasted. To actually meet the 8th Earl of Harewood, when it was the 2nd Earl of Harewood who owned my grandparents, it's quite huge. David, thank you for hosting me.
You're welcome.
I've just come back from Barbados and done work in terms of discovering my history and my family connections. So, here we have the slave returns. At the top there it says, the Right Honourable 2nd Earl of Harewood. And you see Betty.
Yes.
And here at the top there we've got Richard. So my great-great-great-great-grandparents were slaves on your family's plantation.
Yeah.
And this is a fine house, it's in beautiful grounds, but it was built on the proceeds of slavery. Do you feel any guilt or shame about that?
No, not in a personal way. I mean, I don't feel that feeling guilty for something that you had no involvement with is a helpful emotion. I think you need to take responsibility for your own actions. But in this, I don't feel responsible, but I feel accountable, I guess. Yeah, there's nothing you can do to change the past, nothing. But you can be active in the present.
And in what ways are you actively helping to do that?
Well, we did a lot around the time of 2007, the bicentenary abolition of the slave trade, and subsequently, a lot of things to do with the programming we have here, artists we've worked with, educationalists we've worked with, and so on. What I'm responsible for is what I try to do about that legacy, to try, in a small way, to make that a sort of force for good today.
Harewood House signals the end of David's journey into his own story and its connection to the history of slavery.
I underestimated the psychological toll of it, and knowing how much pushback there has been against Black Lives Matter in the press and on my social media, it's exhausting to deal with the ignorance. People saying, get over it. Because it's tangible for me. It's stuff that I'm kind of dealing with and working through. And my daughters. Will be able to know where they came from and understand where they came from. In a way that I didn't. And so it's a sense of history, I think, and sense of story and longevity. An understanding of who I am. I'm not just this kid that just comes from Birmingham, you know. I'm more than that.
Next time, Rachel Johnson travels to Venice to uncover the city's dark history.
Women were traded like any other commodity here in Venice, you know, silk or spices.
While Karen Gibson, who's been called the godmother of gospel, discovers the incredible story of enslaved African turned virtuoso violinist, Joseph Emedy.
Torn from his parents, his family, and everything that he knew at the age of 12. And then within a few short years, he's playing in an orchestra. It beggars belief, really.
And Trisha Goddard discovers shocking details about the Indian Ocean slave trade.
The children, there's so
yeah,
many
there's
children.
mostly children.
Oh my God.
And 1000 Years a Slave continues next Tuesday at 10. On the final leg of his journey, Alexander Armstrong sees for himself the alarming effects of climate change in Iceland, brand new tomorrow at 9. And it's a terrifying ordeal for an 11-year-old trapped in the wreckage of a car. Ambulance Code Red is next.
On the charge sheet of human history, few things create such an indelible stain as slavery.
The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse. Nothing.
Yet few histories are more important for us to understand.
It's power to know what happened to you in the past. Because if you don't know what happened to you in the past, you can't stop it from happening again.
In this series, many well-known faces with a direct and often surprising link to this 1,000-year story are embarking on journeys to different corners of the globe. They'll uncover the truth about their past and tell the story of oppression and exploitation, and even how a very different trade saw women sold at market by their own fathers.
Human flesh was traded alongside carpets, nuts, spices as recently as 150 years ago, which blows my mind.
With expert knowledge from across continents, their journeys will be complemented by descendants, celebrities, and historians to tell the bigger story of the enslaved peoples of the world.
The enslavement of Africans changed our language. It changed what we eat, what we wear, what we drink, and created a force that still divides us today.
Yet slavery also inspired resistance and rebellion. From a brave but doomed uprising in Jamaica.
I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm proud to be who I am, and I'm proud where I come from, and who I come from.
To a long overdue reckoning in our own lifetime.
Black Lives Matter!
This is the 1,000-year story of how slavery stained our past and shaped the modern world. In this episode, we investigate the stories of 3 people whose forced journeys determine the course of their lives and those of their ancestors.
I'm making the same journey as my own great-great-grandmother 150 years ago.
From the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, they reveal a hidden world of exploitation and survival.
Just looking into the faces on those photos, that really got me.
Our travelers uncover their own direct links to slavery and how it was shaped by religion, racism, and greed. Karen Gibson is the conductor of the London-based Kingdom Choir. They performed at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. She grew up in London, the daughter of Guyanese parents, and has been called Britain's godmother of gospel. Karen is traveling to Lisbon to find out more about the extraordinary life of Joseph Emedy, a talented 18th century African musician. His enslavement led him on a 6,000-mile journey to the Portuguese capital via Latin America.
The history of this Negro musician, Emedy, is too remarkable to be passed over in silence. He was born in Guinea, on the west coast of Africa, sold into slavery to some Portuguese traders, taken by them to the Brazils when quite a boy.
I think we can't talk about the history of slavery without talking about South America. The vast majority of people who were enslaved and taken from their homelands were brought to Brazil. What really needs to happen is this broader viewpoint that looks at slavery's role in making the modern world. South America becomes a deeply, deeply important part of that system of enslavement.
Too young for heavy work, Emedy was probably enslaved in a wealthy household in Rio. He showed a talent for music, and when his master returned to Portugal, he took Emedy with him.
He manifested such a love for music that he was supplied with a violin and a teacher, and in the course of 3 or 4 years, he became sufficiently proficient to be admitted as one of the second violins in the orchestra of the opera at Lisbon. It's amazing to think that at the age of 16, Emedy ends up here at the Lisbon Opera House. I mean, what a journey. It beggars belief, really, How do you make that transition? How do you go through that trauma and that adversity and still achieve that level of success? It's absolutely incredible.
Karen is meeting Professor Rodriguez King Dorset to get an insight into Emidy's extraordinary rise as a musician.
How did Emedy come to be playing second violin at the Royal Opera House in Lisbon?
I think it was very unusual, but I think that Emidy's talent was such that his former master would look and say, if they teach him the rudiments of the violin and the flute, for instance, he then becomes a skillful fashion item. So there's a bit of a one-upmanship for the masters and the mistress to show him off. And remember, at this point, he is technically a free man. The moment he stepped foot in Lisbon, he's a free man.
Why do you say that?
Because when he's in Brazil, he's a slave. In 1761, in Portugal, slavery was abolished.
Emedy may have been technically free, but his freedoms would have been limited, and he still had to sing for his supper.
It's assumed that black people have more musical ability. And that's partly because the people who could, that's how they were visible in white society, and that's how they ate.
Black folk can do everything. It's simple as that, we can. But it's not seen or accepted that we can. They can be absolutely brilliant, but they mustn't get above their station.
There is so much that has been lost because of the inhumanity of slavery. Millions of people who were lost aboard ship. Culture is what helps us reclaim them.
As a youngster, I myself played classical music. I played the piano and the oboe, and I would say that it gave me a sense of purpose, it gave me identity. And I wonder if it was the same for the young Emedy at 16 years old. I wonder if music was an escape or gave him a sense of solace.
Slavery may have been abolished in Portugal, but the slave trade was still thriving all over the world. Africans continued to be transported across the Atlantic, but also across the Indian Ocean from East Africa. Coming up, Trisha Goddard discovers the cruel fate of children enslaved in East Africa.
They were just taken from one kind of slavery to another.
And Rachel Johnson uncovers her own family's connection to a very different form of slavery.
Women were traded like any other commodity here in Venice, you know, silk or spices.
Venice, jewel of the Renaissance, prosperous, sophisticated, yet beneath the refinement lurks a dark and surprising history.
This is an absolutely beautiful city, but Venice is built on the sweat of thousands of slaves who've been trafficked into this city.
The gateway between East and Western Europe, Venice became a leading naval power for centuries and relied on maritime trade for its survival. Writer Rachel Johnson, sister of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has come to Venice to discover the truth about a family story. A story which reveals her great-great-grandmother was a victim of a form of slavery, very different from what was taking place thousands of miles away in the New World.
I feel actually quite stunned by it. I really do.
Venice was at the center of a very peculiar type of slave trade in the Renaissance. Whilst Venice was the place you would go to buy rare brocades and Middle Eastern silks, Venice is also the place where you buy someone that can stitch them into clothes.
Until the 9th century, Venetian merchants were engaged in a thriving trade, indiscriminately selling captive men and women to Islamic nations. But in 840 AD, a treaty outlawed the sale of Christians to Muslims. Venetian traders began to look east to fill the demand, selecting captives not by race, but by religion. Ships docked and unloaded their cargo along today's Riva Schiavoni, shore of the Slavs. The word slave derives from Slav.
I had this childish binary idea that it was all slaves trafficked from Africa to the New World.
Some of the enslaved were sold to wealthy Venetians. They became valuable assets and were treated accordingly.
The overwhelming majority of people who came here as slaves were coming from the Black Sea area. And so they were Russian, Tartar, Circassians. When they come here, they were converted to Christianity. So they were assimilated to the family, especially with women, became very intimate.
You weren't chained. You didn't have to go and break boulders in the field.
No, they must be protected during their lifetime because they had a huge value. And so it means a good health, a good treatment.
Apparently, ciao is etymologically to do with slavery.
Yeah, it's a Venetian word, schiavo in Venetian, schiavo in Italian. It was a very polite way to say hello at that time, to say that I'm your slave.
In Venice in the 1400s, slaves were important as a status symbol. A major staple of luxury would have been a Circassian slave. The Circassians, white Muslims from today's southern Russia, were highly prized as luxury workers.
Rachel's great-great-grandmother came from Circassia and was sold by her own family as a girl.
I'm seeing this city in a very, very different light now. Women were a commodity. They were traded like any other commodity here in Venice, you know, silk or spices.
To find out what life might have been like for her great-great-grandmother, Rachel has come to the Venice State Archive. It holds records of enslaved people traded here.
Questo è proprio un atto notarile stilato a Venezia nel luglio del 1433, in cui vediamo una compravendita di una schiava circassa. Le schiave venivano adibite per i lavori domestici. Una schiava di bella presenza era quasi sempre destinata anche a diventare un oggetto sessuale. O se nella sua fortuna una concubina con poi prole e i figli potevano quasi anche essere poi legittimati o comunque essere tenuti in grande considerazione.
This was one of the crucial differences between slavery in medieval Venice and the forms of slavery that developed in the New World, in which the children of enslaved women were born into enslavement. In 876 AD, a law was introduced in Venice that banned all slave trading, but the law was flouted.
Era più conveniente continuare a commerciare gli schiavi e pagare la multa, il gioco è fatto.
The profits from slavery were so great that it was worth paying the penalty for if you were caught.
Sì.
Even though it was officially banned, the city was so addicted to the luxury, the leisure and pleasure of having slaves that slavery carried on for the next 500 years.
The victims of Venetian slavery were people of different races. Skin color did not mark a person out as free or enslaved. As a result, the descendants of Venetian slaves, unlike the descendants of enslaved Africans, have not had to face the centuries of racism and discrimination. That history of the trafficking of Africans into slavery began far further back in time than many people realize, and not in the Atlantic, but on the other side of the African continent.
The Indian Ocean slave trade is probably the oldest of the slave trades and transported more human beings, and it was multi-directional.
Exports of the enslaved from the Indian Ocean to the Muslim world grew exponentially after Arab traders won control of the Swahili coast and sea routes in the 8th century. the trafficking of millions of human beings from Africa's east coast led to the emergence of African diaspora communities, like the Shidi in Pakistan and India, and Afro-Iraqis in Basra.
Islamic law does not permit slave trading. Many Muslims throughout the Indian Ocean world ignored those rules. And so they plundered and captured Africans, Indians, Southeast Asians, usually non-Muslims.
Both Christianity and Islam asserted the value of a person as created by God. Yet both religions accepted the capture, sale, and ownership of men, women, and children from Africa. The Atlantic trade to the west centered on labor and shipped at least 2 men for every woman. The Indian Ocean trade to the east centered on services and included soldiers, cooks, and concubines. It shipped roughly 2 women for every man. The key location was in modern-day Tanzania, the island of Zanzibar, under control of the Omani Arab Empire from the 17th century. For 200 years, it specialized in 3 things: ivory, spices, and slaves. British TV journalist Trisha Goddard moved to East Africa with her family in the 60s before returning to England at the age of 9.
I spent a few years of my childhood in Tanzania, and I've got to say they were the happiest years of my childhood. It was the beginning of the 1960s. Tanzania was newly formed. My father wanted to go and help a newly formed African state.
In 1807, Britain finally turned its back on the slave trade. Royal Navy warships were dispatched to the Atlantic to suppress the slave trades of other nations. Some of the Africans freed from slavery were resettled in Freetown in Sierra Leone. Others were sent to work in the West Indies. Over the course of the 19th century, thousands of British sailors died intercepting foreign slave ships. And the mission to end the slave trade led the Royal Navy into the Indian Ocean and into direct conflict with the slave traders of Zanzibar. Now living in the US, Trisha has come to Greenwich, Connecticut to find out more about the history of the slave trade through Zanzibar. Professor Bernard Freeman is a leading expert on slavery in the Indian Ocean. He has a rare series of 19th century photographs taken by the British Royal Navy.
So what's that, Bernard?
Well, this is a photo that's taken on the deck of a British naval ship called the London. And this was probably taken somewhere near Zanzibar. All of these black people in the center of the photo are rescued slaves. And as you see...
They're children. There's so
yeah,
many
there's
children.
mostly children and boys and girls and some teenage boys as well.
Under pressure from the British, the slave trade was banned in Zanzibar in 1873 by Sultan Bargash bin Said, but unofficially, slavery continued.
After Bargash abolished the slave trade between Zanzibar and the mainland, an illegal trade sprung up, and the British Navy instituted a patrol. The Royal Navy paid a bounty for the capture of a slave ship.
Oh.
So the sailors got cash for capturing the slave boat.
Bernard has a newspaper article from the Anti-Slavery Reporter, published in London in 1877. It shows what life was like for the enslaved freed by the Royal Navy.
Most people don't know this. Instead of being repatriated with their families and in their villages in East Africa, they were sent to labor camps.
But would families, if there were families, would they be kept together?
Probably not. Some of it was based on demand. Who needed workers? And so oftentimes they would be shipped to the Seychelles, to South Africa, to Mauritius, which had big sugar plantations. It's really not much different, or it could even be worse than slavery. So instead of getting a wage at the end of the month, the liberated African would get a bill for the food, for the housing, for the medical care. And so you would never work off that debt.
They
No.
were just basically taken from one kind of slavery to another.
That's correct.
Just looking into the faces on those photos, that really got me. It's just the inhumanity. I'm still trying to find out about my own ancestry. My mother came from the island of Dominica. One of my loved ones could be many of those faces on any ship, in any photo. It's a really sobering and scary thought.
The enslavement of Africans, taken as a whole, over hundreds of years, changed the world. It changed our language, it changed the demographics of the world, and it took this idea of race, based on something as meaningless as skin color, and it created this fissure, this divide, this fracture that still shapes the world today. We are living and navigating in the ruins of the empire of slavery.
Having learnt of Emidy's emancipation and musical career in Lisbon, Karen Gibson now wants to find out what happened next. She is retracing Emidy's footsteps on the night he lost his freedom for the second time.
Emedy had just finished giving one of those magnificent performances that he's been known for.
Yes.
He would have packed his violin and he would have made his way out this exit stage door. Unbeknown to Emedy, there was a ship that was anchored just 300 yards down the road there. Captain Pellew, who was in charge of that ship, and two of his lieutenants decided that they needed a fiddler for their ship, and Emedy was their man. So as soon as Emedy came out of the door, one of them would have knocked him out and then bundled him on the ship, and then for the next 4 years, he was their fiddler. They had got their man.
So essentially, he was kidnapped.
He was kidnapped.
At any time during the day, you could have a bag thrown under your head and wake up on a ship to be sold back. And even when you did get free, you could be sold back into slavery. So you were constantly terrorized.
Slavery was meant to dehumanize. And only if you can get people in that frame of mind could you then make them do absolutely what you wanted them to do.
Poor Emedy was thus forced, against his will, to descend from the high regions of the music in which he delighted, Gluck, Haydn, Cimarosa, and Mozart, to desecrate his violin to hornpipes, jigs, and reels, which he loathed and detested.
As the months go by and the years go by, they would have broken his soul. Yeah. The captain's duty is to keep up the morale of his crew. And Emedy was part of that. And if Emedy was not up to it, they would have, in no uncertain terms, have kicked his black ass with that violin.
I can't imagine what that must be like, to be able to have to give away over and over again the thing that you love and the thing that means something to you, to somebody who has no respect for you. This story of Emedy constantly brings me back to the story of my own family. My great-great-grandfather was also brought over from West Africa to Guyana as a slave. I'd love to know the story. I'd love to fill in the missing pieces. And maybe that's why this story of Emedy so resonates with me.
Next, Rachel Johnson travels to Istanbul to uncover more of her family history. And American TV host Shannon Lanier investigates a very personal connection to US President Thomas Jefferson.
He's the man who wrote that all men are created equal. Yet he's also the man who owned at least 600 people.
Rachel Johnson has come to Istanbul, once the capital of the Ottoman Empire, to search for the truth about her great-great-grandmother.
My name reflects my very mixed heritage. I've got Muslim, Christian and Anglo-Saxon and Jewish grandparents. And Johnson is actually the name that we were given when my grandfather, who was half Turkish, naturalized. You know, my grandfather, he never talked about the fact he was Turkish. And I don't think it was much spoken of that my great-great-grandmother was a slave. That was a cause of shame and embarrassment. And he, of course, changed his name from Osman Ali to Wilfred Johnson. There can be no bigger statement of cleansing the past. I feel that if I find out about my great-great-grandmother, I will necessarily find out more about myself.
Like Venice, most slavery in the Ottoman Empire is a lot more niche, is about skills. So we're going to have prostitution, we're going to have accountants, we're going to have translators, we're going to have craftsmen.
Rachel believes her great-great-grandmother was sold in a market here in the mid-1800s, not by a slave trader, but by her own father.
So I've been told that somewhere around here, between the mosque and the Grand Bazaar, human flesh was traded alongside carpets, nuts, spices, silver, a baklava, you name it, as recently as 150 years ago, which blows my mind.
Captive men and women came from all over the empire. The North African Barbary states, allies of the Ottomans, enslaved people from all over Europe. But the most valued slaves came from the Black Sea, from where the Ottomans took roughly 2.5 million Circassians. Rachel is meeting her cousin, Sinan Kunaralp, a diplomatic historian and publisher, in the hope he can shine light on the life of their ancestor.
Our forefather, Hajj Ahmed, was a self-made man, basically, and his first wife died early. And so he applied to a middleman, saying that I am in the market for a young, fairly nice, good-looking bride-to-be. There was a network of people who would provide brides from Circassia. It was a region famed for the beauty of their womenfolk, and it was a supply for the Istanbul harems, because they were tall, blonde, blue-eyed women with very forceful character. This gentleman, very fierce-looking, is Hanife's father, the man who sold his daughter. He's a tribesman, a warlord, a brigand. Hanife is here. This is one of her daughters.
There's a, would I say, a Johnson look?
Yes. Hajj Ahmed Hamdi would have been 43 when he married this 13-year-old.
13.
In today's context, it sounds completely unnatural, considering the conditions in the small villages of Circassia where existence was very threadbare and very frugal. Becoming the wife of a wealthy trader or merchant is definitely an improvement.
Were Hanife Frida's slave origins a source of pride or shame? Or maybe both?
Shame? Certainly not, because considering that the sultans were all sons of slave girls. Hanife went on to have 4 children. Her firstborn, your great-grandfather, Ali Kemal, who became a politician.
Minister for the Interior, which is the equivalent
in the Turkish context, Minister of Interior, the Home Secretary. And the...
So a very important man.
Absolutely.
"10 days in a boat crossing the Black Sea to meet a man she'd never met, 3 times her age, who she was going to have to marry." I mean, what a future, what a scary future for her. The loss of her family, of her homeland, of her own choice of husband, of choosing who to have your children with. These are the main things in a human being's life. And those were things that she never had.
In the Ottoman Empire, slavery was comparable to what you would see in many other countries around the world. However, there were some differences. One of the main differences was that as a slave, it was possible for a person to rise in power and esteem.
But in the colonies of North America, a different type of slavery had been emerging. Drawing on the brutal slave code of Barbados, enslaved Africans were legally defined as chattel or personal property with no right to life or liberty. In Virginia in 1790, over 39% of those working in tobacco fields were enslaved. This was more than a decade after the US Declaration of Independence claimed all men are created equal.
It deliberately, purposefully, intentionally, and literally made human beings into objects, into commodities. It literally dehumanized them.
All right, let's go.
Shannon Lanier is one of America's most successful TV hosts. He's come with his family to Monticello in Virginia. This 5,000-acre plantation was home to US President Thomas Jefferson, who owned more than 600 slaves. When he was growing up, Shannon was told by his relatives that he was a descendant of an enslaved woman and the president himself.
So when I was in second grade, I proudly stood up and told the entire class, Thomas Jefferson is my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And the teacher said, sit down and stop telling lies. Of course, the whole class laughed, and I was devastated about it.
Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, captured in this artist's impression, was denied for almost 2 centuries, until DNA evidence proved the link in 1998.
It's important that we don't push away our history and cherry pick what we want to tell. It'll help us understand our past, where we come from, and how to improve the future. Okay?
Shannon is meeting Professor Krista Dirkscheid, a Jefferson scholar at the University of Virginia. Shannon knows that Sally spent time with Jefferson in Paris, but he's not sure how that was possible when slavery was illegal there.
So I've got a document to show you, Shannon, that I think says a lot about your ancestors when they were brought by Jefferson to Paris. And I think you'll see there on the list of wages that Jefferson's paying people in his household. Do you recognize any names there?
I see Sally here, Sally Hemings, and her brother, James Hemings.
Yep.
This is from 1788.
Yep. Sally Hemings had arrived for the first time in Paris, and we see that Jefferson is paying her and her brother wages, which would have been the first time that they're receiving money and income from Jefferson, their owner.
Now, why do you think he did that?
Well, because slavery was illegal in France at this time. So Jefferson didn't want to draw attention to the fact that he had human property within his household in Paris. So paying them was a way of making them look more like servants, I think.
Because he knew it was wrong.
Yes.
Paris in the 1780s was a bustling cosmopolitan city, a world away from the plantation state of Virginia, where Sally grew up. It was here that Hemings and Jefferson's relationship began.
I think these wage books really show us part of the kind of freedom and mobility that James and Sally Hemings would have experienced in Paris. Sally Hemings was learning French, so she was accompanying Jefferson's daughters out in Parisian society. Jefferson bought her very fine clothes, so she would have known that she was on free soil.
And I know it was there because she was free that her brother James wanted to stay in Paris, and he was like, stay with me, Sally, because we're free here. But she decided to come back with Thomas Jefferson. He promised her that however many children they had together, that he would free them at the age of 21 if she returned with him.
Yes, unlike other generations of enslaved women, she would break that cycle and her children would actually be free.
Well, that's one of the things that bothers me about Jefferson is that he knew slavery was wrong. He even tried to put it in the Declaration of Independence that, you know, the slaves should be freed, and yet he did nothing to help further it here at his plantation or anywhere else.
Krista is taking Shannon to Mulberry Row. Sally would probably have lived here when she returned to Virginia from France in 1789.
This long driveway was really the hub of industry on this enormous plantation.
I know a lot of the Hemings receives preferential treatment here on Monticello.
Part of the agreement is that she would be able to be with her children as they grew up. And this is so different than the vast majority of enslaved children at Monticello in Virginia.
Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Sally. 4 survived to adulthood. 2 were freed in Jefferson's lifetime, the other 2 when he died in 1826.
You know, a lot of people ask me about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings because it lasted over 38 years, and they like to romanticize it. It's definitely easier for some family members to not think of their great-grandmother being raped for 38 years, but I just don't think it could have been a love relationship based on the dynamics that she was, you know, 14, 15, 16 at the time, and she was a slave.
Sally Hemings was a teenage enslaved African-American girl. What bargaining power did she have? It was rape.
Thomas Jefferson, founding father, 3rd president of the United States, and author of the Declaration of Independence. He's the man who wrote that all men are created equal. Yet he's also the man who owned at least 600 people.
Next, Rachel Johnson finds out the value put on her great-great-grandmother.
I was really shocked that her life was really so cheap.
And Karen Gibson discovers what became of the twice-enslaved violinist, Joseph Emedy.
After what he suffered, you know, he wins in the end.
In Istanbul, writer Rachel Johnson is tracing the history of her family's connection to slavery. She's meeting Hakan Erden, an expert on Ottoman slavery. She wants to find out what value would have been placed on an enslaved teenage girl.
So this is my great-great-grandmother as a middle-aged woman. She was sold, I think, when she was 15. Have you any idea how much she might have commanded in a marketplace?
Well, you know, the million-dollar question, because after the Russians, when they defeated the Circassian Confederation in 1864, they emigrated to Ottoman Empire en masse, around 1.5 million. And about 10% were slaves. I have an article that appeared in New York Daily Times. There's an absolute glut in the market, and in former times, a good middling Circassian girl was sold very cheap at £100. But at the present moment, the same description of goods may be had for £5.
So, but her warlord father then was really not making a lot of money.
Probably he lived through dire straits and he was compelled to sell the daughter, but I'm sure he negotiated a good place for his daughter.
Because she married the very rich, wealthy trader of tallow candles. He had to, in a way, protect his daughter from poverty, starvation, God knows what, in Circassia. So the only option there was, really. I was really shocked when Hakan said that my ancestor was probably sold for very little money. And it made me feel sad that her life was really so cheap. I hesitate to say that being sold into slavery and having to marry an older man was a good thing, but it was the best available option to her. It's an incredible story, and I feel actually quite stunned by it. I really do.
Back in the UK, Karen Gibson has been doing more research into the life of Joseph Emedy, a talented African musician press-ganged aboard an English naval ship by Captain Pellew. After 4 years at sea, Emedy was finally able to leave the ship when it returned to England. It was 1799. He was 24. It didn't take long for his musical talent to shine through.
He first began by going out to parties to play the violin, which he did to a degree of perfection never before heard in Cornwall. This led to his being engaged as a teacher and then a leader at concerts, so that by degrees he made rapid progress in reputation and means.
Emedy soon became known as a talented multi-instrumentalist and composer. He went on to lead a symphony orchestra, ironically in the same town where Captain Pellew was educated.
You may not have seen this before, but this is Truro Philharmonic Society, and there is Joseph Emedy himself,
Wow,
leading the
amazing.
orchestra.
I have not seen this. How good was Emedy's music that he wrote himself?
We can only guess, really, but probably the best clue we've got is a quote from Silk Buckingham, who said that given the right opportunities, Emedy could have been another Mendelssohn or another Beethoven. But his colleagues thought that Emedy's race would be against him.
Wow. Why do you think we don't have any copies of his music today?
It seems to me likely that at the time he was simply unappreciated. Probably when his wife died, then the music was just cleared out and bundled away. Very sad, but that's the situation we're left with.
Joseph Emedy's story only survives because it was documented by his friend, James Silk Buckingham. With no one to record them, the stories of millions of other enslaved people have been lost.
And I feel, in some way, that in being able to retell Emedy's story is that I'm claiming something back. Not just for him, but for us all of the African diaspora whose ancestors had their freedom taken. Some whose names we will never know. Some whose stories, long ago, buried and forgotten. But I feel that every time we resurrect a story, we're telling all our stories. Here lie deposited the mortal remains of Mr. Joseph Antonia Emedy, who departed this life on the 23rd of April, 1835. He was a native of Portugal, which country he quitted about 40 years since, and pursuing the musical profession, resided in Cornwall until the close of his earthly career. They have described him as a native of Portugal. But he wasn't a native of Portugal. Actually, he was a native of Guinea. That's where he was born. I would hope that he found peace within himself. He was successful and he was happy and he lived a peaceful life. After all he suffered, you know, he wins in the end. That's what I feel.
When we think about figures like Joseph Emedy, we have to imagine that what they are fleeting glimpses of the human costs of the slave trade. A handful, tiny number of people who were the victims of slavery were able to find freedom, to find education, and then find the opportunity, critically, to express their talents and their abilities and their humanity. We think about them, and then we think about the millions whose lives were just consumed on plantations in America, in the Caribbean, in Brazil.
Next time, actor Ray Fearon discovers how the enslaved on some of those plantations rose up in rebellion and helped finally put an end to slavery.
They fought for their freedom, and I am here and a product of that freedom.
And the daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. remembers how her father continued that fight for freedom and full racial equality.
My daddy was saying, we're gonna keep doing what we're doing because this is the right thing.
And you can see that next Tuesday at 10
Bettany Hughes reveals the undiscovered stories of victims of the historic eruption at Mount Vesuvius. Pompeii, Secrets of the Dead is brand new Thursday at 9. The party's over for revelers after the break after a terrifying incident at a nightclub. We join the paramedics racing to help in Ambulance Code Red next.
On the charge sheet of human history, few things create such an indelible stain as slavery.
The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse. Nothing.
Yet few histories are more important for us to understand.
It's power to know what happened to you in the past. Because if you don't know what happened to you in the past, you can't stop it from happening again.
In this series, many well-known faces with a direct and often surprising link to this 1,000-year story are embarking on journeys to different corners of the globe. They'll uncover the truth about their past and tell the story of the oppression and exploitation of one human being by another.
It beggars belief, really. How do you make that transition? How do you go through that trauma and that adversity?
With expert knowledge from across continents, their journeys will be complemented by descendants, celebrities, and historians to tell the bigger story of the enslaved peoples of the world.
The enslavement of Africans changed our language. It changed what we eat, what we wear, what we drink, and created a force that still divides us today.
Yet slavery also inspired resistance and rebellion. From a brave but doomed uprising in Jamaica.
I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm proud to be who I am, and I'm proud where I come from and who I come from.
To a long overdue reckoning in our own lifetime.
Black Lives Matter!
This is the 1,000-year story of how slavery stained our past and shaped the modern world. This episode explores two rebellions by the enslaved that changed the course of history and hastened the abolition of slavery in America and across the British Empire. In Jamaica, actor Ray Fearon discovers how one man bravely advocated non-violent resistance in the face of the most brutal oppression.
This is like the beginning of civil rights.
Absolutely, 100 years before Martin Luther King or Gandhi.
Whilst in New Haven, Connecticut, the great-great-grandson of Sengbe Pier, leader of the famous revolt on the slave ship the Amistad, investigates how it changed the perception of slavery in America.
Sengbe Pier is a light in a dark world. It's a very positive example, not only of the 1840s, but even in the 21st century.
And Lenny Henry helps tell the story of Cujo Kosala Lewis, a survivor of the Catilda, the last known ship to bring enslaved Africans to America.
When I think about that time, I try not to cry no more.
While the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. shines a light on the connection between another survivor of the Catilda and the civil rights movement.
My father clearly understood that we had to have free access to the ballot.
Actor Ray Fearon starred in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and Kenneth Branagh's film version of Hamlet. He's come to Jamaica to explore a history that is part of his identity. Ray was born in London to Jamaican parents.
My mother and father came from here to Great Britain to try to make a living and have a family. My mother left at 19, father left at 25. and they never saw their parents alive again. I'm proud to be Jamaican and I'm proud to be British. I am part of that experience.
Growing up in London, Ray knew little about his parents' life in Jamaica, except that his Jamaican-born father was descended from a group of escaped, enslaved people known as Maroons.
My father's father was a Maroon. They fought the British. They didn't want to be slaves. They rebelled and ran off into the hills.
Because of the tradition of rebellion, or marronage, and the geography of Jamaica that enabled the Maroons to evade capture, the British treated the enslaved here harshly.
Jamaica is a very mountainous country, a very heavily forested country. That lent itself to various forms of resistance and marronage and rebellion, and also the attempt to suppress this type of rebellion made Jamaica a case where violence was rampant.
The mainstay of the Jamaican economy was sugar. Roughly half of the enslaved population worked on plantations. Such was the demand for labor, enslaved Africans soon outnumbered white settlers by 10 to 1.
How did this small number of whites control this large number of enslaved Africans? Well, many times they would find the most rebellious, the biggest, or the most influential enslaved African on a plantation and publicly whip that person. A lot of times, planters even went beyond the legal limits of whipping. Women were raped, men were castrated to terrorize people.
Ray has been reading the infamous diaries kept by one planter, Thomas Thistlewood. To find out more about him, Ray is meeting Dr. Shani Roper, museum curator at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica's capital, Kingston.
Now, I've come across these personal diaries and they're horrific accounts of treatments to slaves on plantations, and I want to know more.
Okay. Thomas Thistlewood, he comes to Jamaica in 1750.
Yeah.
He becomes an overseer and then eventually purchases his own plantation. He kept a diary consistently. It works out to be about 10,000 pages of notations of daily life. Who he was, however, is a sadist and a rapist. And he got great pleasure, I would say, in inflicting pain. No one was safe. This particular enslaved woman, Sally, over the course of 3-4 years, Thistlewood had raped that particular woman over 200 times. The enslaved women, they run away very often. And, you know, they would bring them back. He would put them in stocks, get them whipped, and then he would have sex with them. A lot.
Yeah.
And multiple times.
Flogged Fanny for fighting with Phoebe, and twice after for her great impudence. Flogged Lincoln for not bringing Sally Saturday evening. Put a collar and chain around her neck and branded her with TT on her right cheek. Her private parts is torn, which was discovered this morning by her having bled a very great deal.
The TT hair on her right cheek will indicate to the community who she was, who she belonged to.
The property
as
of
property.
Thomas.
The property of Thomas Thistlewood.
Reading all these accounts about these enslaved people, The fact that you can put names, Sally, you know, Darby, these are our ancestors. You know, that could have been my father's mother.
My parents are both born in Jamaica and grew up there and worked there and had children there. And I know it sounds hard to understand, but they didn't talk to us about slavery at all. It's just a sadistic, horrendous collection of tales. We're very familiar with Nazi Germany, and there's pictures of those bodies when they got to some of the camps. Imagine if we had pictures of some of the stuff that went on in the fields and at houses and plantations. It would just be horrendous.
The most optimistic reading you can make of the diary of Thomas Thistlewood is that he must have been a psychopath. But the problem is that Thistlewood mentions in his diary other slave owners who, it's apparent from what he's saying, know what he's doing and are doing something similar. And that leads you to the far less comforting conclusion that this man was not an exception.
As planters like Thomas Thistlewood brutally tried to impose control, it would only be a matter of time before the enslaved people of Jamaica could take no more and would rise up. And in America, a bloody revolt aboard the slave ship the Amistad leads to a court case that will change the course of history. By the early 19th century, Britain and most of America's northern states had taken steps towards the abolition of slavery. But the moral arguments of the abolitionists held little sway with plantation owners in the Deep South or parts of Latin America. Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, is one of the oldest and most prestigious educational institutions in the US. Today, it's proud of its association with the rescue of a Spanish-owned slave ship from Cuba, the Amistad, discovered in American waters in 1839.
The story of the Amistad is incredibly important in world history in the 19th century. It is one of several stories that becomes a cause célèbre during the period of growing abolitionism.
Samuel Pierre is the great-great-grandson of Sembe Pierre, who in 1839 led the revolt aboard the Amistad and challenged slavery in the American courts.
Sembe Pierre is a light in a dark world. It's a very positive example, not only of the 1840s, but even in the 21st century. And it reassures me of the power of diversity. It just reinforces my reason for being here. So justice for me is what I hope to accomplish.
Samuel has come to Yale to find out more about how a small but determined uprising of enslaved Africans helped change the perception of slavery in America.
David, it's such a pleasure to meet you.
He's meeting David Blight, Sterling Professor of History and African American Studies.
Can you tell me all you know about the Amistad Revolt, especially the role of my great-great-grandfather?
Well, what we know about your great-great-grandfather as a person is not enough. What we do know is that he led the insurrection aboard that ship.
The story came to light in the summer of 1839, when the Amistad was discovered by the US Navy, having strayed into American waters. On board, were 53 enslaved people, including Samuel's great-great-grandfather, Sengbe Pierre, captured in Sierra Leone in West Africa.
The Amistad captives, as they became known, revolted aboard that ship, killed the entire crew, except the captain and the first mate. Now, they were brought here to New Haven, Connecticut, jailed, in effect, in the city jail. What was their status? Who were they? Were these people slaves and murderers because they had killed the crew of the ship? Or were they free people who had liberated themselves and then were now liberated here on American soil?
There are repeated incidents of revolts on board slave ships. The slave traders on those ships lived in dreaded fear of the enslaved people, and they were absolutely right to do that because there was resistance routinely on slave ships.
In Yale's Beinecke Library is evidence of how public perception of enslaved Africans, at least in North America, was beginning to change.
My, that's nice.
It houses a unique collection of sketches of the Amistad captives made while they were awaiting trial. Most were from the Mende ethnic group.
These are done by a young man named William H. Townsend. Townsend, like all of his neighbors in New Haven, would have no doubt gone to the New Haven Green, where the Mende people were held in captivity.
It seems like an artist who had an unbiased mind, clear line of vision.
The government gave Western clothes to the Mende, and so some of these portraits, such as this portrait of Pona, really give a sense of what they were wearing while they were awaiting trial.
Yeah, a sense of determined young people who wanted to be active for their own liberation. That's impressive.
Portraits of enslaved Africans in the early 19th century are rare. They were often seen as less than human, as mere property or chattel.
They almost have a contemporary look to them. If you didn't know that these were done in 1839, 1840, they could be sketches that had been done in our own time.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I am very emotional to see all of these sketches of the Amistad Africans. Looking at each one of them, it just reflects the humanity in all of them. It shows the kind of world really I would rather have, where in spite of our diversity, we all have our common dignity. Very, very outstanding artwork.
The determination to win their freedom led the Amistad captives, with the support of American abolitionists, to take their fight to the Supreme Court in February 1841. They hired a former American president to represent them.
John Quincy Adams made the argument before the Supreme Court that whatever the status of that ship, these people deserved their freedom based on natural rights, on the rights they were born with. The majority on that court were justices who were themselves either slaveholders or pro-slavery in their sentiments. But nevertheless, they voted 7-1 to free the Amistad captives. It is an important historical moment when Americans got a lesson in morality. They got a lesson in the good and evil on both sides of this story.
Negroes of Amistad. These gentlemen were immediately informed yesterday of the decision of the Great Court that they were to be set at liberty.
That was great news. That must have been the best news that Saint-Pierre could have heard. He could not speak as much English, but in that Supreme Court, he was able to just burst into joy. The rest of the Africans in the court started singing, "We are going back home. Thank God we are going back home."
The Amistad case is a landmark decision because up until that point, all of the institutions of the American state were defending slavery and enslavement. And this was really the first major moment in which the Supreme Court says, no, they're human beings, just like you and me. That's a major development, and it had ricochets across the world.
In Jamaica too, a revolt was afoot that would hasten the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. Actor Ray Fearon, who is descended from enslaved Africans in Jamaica, is here to find out more. Things came to a head in 1831, when a peaceful strike by the enslaved grew into a full-blown rebellion. The rebels were led by Sam Sharp, a 31-year-old preacher who himself was enslaved. Henry Bleeby, a Christian missionary, met Sharp on several occasions and recorded his impressions in a book.
He was of middle size. His fine, sinewy frame was handsomely molded, and his skin as perfect a jet as can be imagined. He had an eye whose brilliancy was almost dazzling.
In Montego Bay, Ray is meeting award-winning publisher Ian Randall, a leading authority on Sam Sharp. He wants to learn more about a name he's heard spoken of since his childhood.
This is a church at which Sam Sharp worshipped, and in fact, it's quite close to the estate where he worked.
Right.
So this would have been the actual pulpit he would have preached from?
Oh, yes. This is where he expounded his ideas about freedom to fellow slaves, and this is where the inspiration for the 1831 rebellion took place.
I heard him 2 or 3 times deliver a speech. I was amazed both at the power and freedom with which he spoke. He appeared to have the feelings and passions of his hearers completely at his command.
But Sam Sharp's influence extended far beyond the walls of his church.
Many Africans were educated. They learned how to read by reading the Bible. And they were allowed by their owners to travel. Sam Sharp traveled all across Jamaica, preaching the gospel to other enslaved people. But while he was doing that, he was also preaching what came to be known as liberation theology, which is the idea that the Bible sanctions freedom of all people.
Most attempted rebellions by the enslaved in the Caribbean were armed and violent. But Sam Sharp advocated peaceful protest.
Because of his religious upbringing, he was instinctively against violence. His aim was to create the first sit-down strike.
So this is like the beginning of civil rights.
Absolutely. 100 years before Martin Luther King or Gandhi, here was a young black slave in Jamaica who developed this concept of peaceful protest.
Wow.
And it would have worked had it not been for the reaction of the white planter class.
That reaction would lead to a violent struggle with many deaths on both sides. But it would also hasten the abolition of slavery.
We shouldn't feel ashamed about any of it.
On the island of Jamaica, actor Ray Fearon is exploring the story of the Sam Sharp Rebellion. On Christmas Day, 1831, Sharp and his fellow rebels went on strike for wages and better living conditions. But 2 days later, it became clear the plantation owners were not going to meet their demands. The strikers began to set fire to the sugarcane crop.
So what was the strategy behind starting the fires?
Part of the strategy was to use the burning of the estates and the smoke, which would have been visible far away, as a signal to other estates to start lighting their estates in very, very carefully planned sequence.
Right.
And the second part of the strategy was to hit at the economic base of the sugar estates.
So all that was a peaceful process because they didn't mean any harm to property or people?
Absolutely not. Sam Sharp's philosophy was of non-violent confrontation.
The British didn't take it that way, did they?
In response to the burning of the sugar estates, the colonial authorities imposed martial law. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by the British forces. "14 whites died in the uprising. More than 200 rebels were killed. Their heads were cut off and mounted on the plantation fences. More than 300 rebels, including Sam Sharp, were rounded up, put on trial, and then executed.
To the very end, even while he was in jail and awaiting trial, he was constantly encouraging the other prisoners who were there, keep their spirits up. And right at the very end, he said that he would rather go to the gallows than live a slave.
Than live a slave.
15 months after the execution of Sam Sharp, in August 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed in the House of Commons. The rebellion and the violence it sparked is believed to have contributed to the passage of the act through the House.
At the end of Sam Sharp's rebellion, there was some agreement that it was not a case of whether or not there would be another rebellion in Jamaica, but when that rebellion would take place. And so the economics of the slave system began to change, because the cost of garrisoning an island in which an enormous slave population was almost guaranteed to rise up again started making sugar slavery look less attractive.
They fought for their freedom. And I am here and a product of that freedom. I am proud of that because I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm proud to be who I am, and I'm proud where I come from and who I come from. We shouldn't feel ashamed about any of that.
Slavery had now been outlawed throughout the British Empire and America's northern states. But an illegal trade in enslaved Africans to plantation owners in America's southern states persisted. In May 2018, editor Deborah Plant published Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo, by writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston. It was written in 1931, but had lain unpublished in archives for over 80 years.
When we look at the narrative that Zora Neale Hurston safeguarded for us, she's showing us this humanity which was denied, this whole cultural wealth of African American peoples.
The book contains interviews in the vernacular, with Cujo Kossela Lewis. He was transported across the Atlantic on the Clotilda, thought to be the last ship to illegally carry enslaved Africans to America. The Clotilda's human contraband was landed in Mobile, Alabama. An extraordinary collection of early photographs of the crew and captives of the Clotilda provides a totally unique record of enslavement.
These are the original photographs from the Clotilda collection. Timothy Mayer, who was the financier of the trip.
Right.
Is Captain William Foster.
Right. It's here on the back.
Some inscription.
Captain Foster brought the last cargo of slaves from Ouida, Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa, southern Alabama in 1860. Okay.
By 1860, the United States was no longer involved in the international slave trade, but we know that there were many shipbuilders and investors who were involved illegally. Mayer commissions Foster to acquire enslaved people from the Benin region and bring them back into the United States illegally. Once they are off-boarded in the Mobile area, Captain Foster actually burns the ship so that no one can find out about this illegal transaction. The 110 people are sold off to planters, and many of them are kept by the Mayer family.
These vivid images of the enslaved survivors of the Clotilda provide a rare and tangible record of their experience.
And here is our Kossela, right? Yeah. And he's smiling. You don't see him smiling a lot.
Yes.
But he's smiling here.
Cujo Kossela Lewis was one of 40 enslaved Africans kept by Timothy Mayer and his brother Jim. These photographs, coupled with interviews Kossela gave to Neil Hurston, provide a powerful first-hand account of the harsh daily life of the enslaved in 1860s Alabama.
Every time the boat stop at the landing, the overseer, the whipping boss, he go down the gangplank and stand there on the ground. The whip stick in his belt. He holler, "Hurry up there, you! Run it fast! Can't you run it no faster than that? You ain't got enough load. Hurry up!" He cut you with the whip if you ain't run fast enough.
But the real significance of the Hurston interviews is what they tell us about Kossela's stolen African heritage and identity.
When Zora Neale Hurston interviews Kossela, she calls him by his African name. And he's so happy that he hears his name called. He says, "My name, not Cujo Lewis, it Kossela." And he goes on to explain that people like Timothy Mayer could not call his name properly, but he says, "My mama, she named me Kossela." As we remember his name, we are remembering his whole idea, vision, and wisdom about who he is. And this allows us to see what happened on the continent. We began to see not only what happened to us, but the effects of it, the trauma.
I see the great many soldiers, and they run with the big knife, and they catch people and saw the neck with the knife. Then they twist the head so it come off the neck. Oh, Lord, Lord, I see the people get killed so fast. When I think about that time, I try not to cry no more. My eyes, they stop crying, but the tears running down inside me all the time. I don't see none of my family.
There's no doubt that as a people, we carry a deep psychological trauma. I can only imagine what it must have been like to see your brother dragged off, or your sister dragged off, or your mother taken, sold, and just what that must have been like, living through that terror of your family just being kind of ripped apart, really, and never seeing them again.
Those people who are the descendants of enslaved people do carry a scar. They do carry a indelible mark, and that mark is associated with an erasure of memory and culture that was stripped on those Atlantic crossings.
Just as Zora Neale Hurston was writing up her interviews with Kossela, another survivor of the Catilda was marching to the courthouse in Selma, Alabama, to demand reparations for her enslavement. Now her great-granddaughters are making the same long walk for justice.
Girls, can you imagine how Grandmama felt walking these roads?
I cannot imagine, but she was a tough lady.
Sisters Dot Sloanes, Gwen Gamble, and Deborah Smith are the great-granddaughters of Matilda McCreer, another survivor of the slave ship, the Catilda. 90 years after she walked 17 miles from the farm where she lived to the courthouse in Selma to demand reparations, they are retracing her footsteps.
Girls, can you imagine how Grandmama felt walking these roads?
I cannot imagine. I'm sure it was rough, but she was a tough lady.
She had a lot of determination, tenacity.
Yes.
Alabama in 1931 was one of the worst places to be living in when you were black because of all the legislation that were there to exploit black people, to terrorize them, to humiliate them. This was also the Great Depression with its misery and an increase in lynching. It took guts for her to actually walk to the courthouse and ask for reparations.
Right in her footsteps.
Yeah, can you imagine how she felt?
No, she was a tired soul.
Matilda was not successful. I mean, she presented her case, but she didn't get anything. And neither her children or grandchildren received any reparations.
Just to be disappointed, denied.
Yeah.
Right. That's really devastating and it's
hurtful.
But in spite of the denial of Matilda's claim for reparations, she had a powerful influence on her great-granddaughters. They would all become civil rights activists. In 1965, when they were teenagers, they took part in a series of famous marches to demand equal voting rights for African Americans in the notoriously segregated state of Alabama.
We all know that there were barriers created to voting for blacks during the 50s in the South especially. There was a heavy disenfranchisement of the black, at that time they called it the Negro population.
Boy, that was someday, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
I remember looking back and seeing all those people just gathering behind us. They were coming from everywhere.
And they had to have known what was ahead of them with the policemen and the dogs.
They did.
The first demonstration the three sisters took part in, on the 7th of March 1965, would become known as Bloody Sunday. The demonstrators had planned to march from Selma to Montgomery to confront segregationist Governor George Wallace. But their route was blocked by state troopers and sheriff's deputies who used clubs, tear gas, and horseback charges to turn them back. TV coverage of this brutal attack prompted thousands of people from all over the country to join a march 2 weeks later. Now, they were led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
My father clearly understood that in order for us to be full participants in society, that we had to have free access to the ballot.
Dr. King was elated just to see that that many people supported that march.
Well, it was so well organized.
Yes, it was. And I'll never forget feeling that this was so important for us in our lifetime, and our children, and our families.
This time, the demonstrators, now under the protection of the Alabama National Guard, successfully reached Montgomery.
My daddy was saying, we're gonna keep doing what we're doing because this is the right thing. We have been deprived all these years of our right to vote.
Today I want to say to the people of America and the nations of the world that we are not about to turn around. Yes, sir. We are on the move now. Yes, sir. Yes, we are on the move, and no wave of racism can stop us. Yes, sir.
The events of March 1965 would pave the way for the Voting Rights Act that passed into law on August the 6th that same year.
This brings back memories that's kind of devastating, but you feel proud to know that you were a part of that.
And to know that you have made an impact on so many other people's lives by just a simple march like that.
It really brought about a change.
It was a very necessary part of the struggle. Without voting rights, everything else is hollow. You're at the behest of an entire system with absolutely no say-so.
But while full voting rights for African Americans had been won, the struggle for racial equality was far from over. 60 years on, a series of fatal shootings and one murder that shakes the world draw attention to the unequal treatment of the black community by the police in Britain and the US, sparking a mass movement.
Black Lives Matter!
It spreads across the globe and forces a searching re-examination of the past. Next time, after the fallout of the murder of George Floyd, historian David Olusoga gets his first glimpse of the toppled statue of slave trader Edward Colston.
This is the perfect object. It speaks for this moment and our relationship with a history that for 2 centuries we've just brushed under the carpet.
And Bristol's mayor, Marvin Rees, tells the story of a bus boycott which transformed Britain's fight for civil rights.
It wasn't just about jobs on the buses. That led to the Race Relations Equalities Act in the UK.
And that's brand new next Tuesday at 10 in 1,000 Years a Slave.
We've the best of drama here on Channel 5, and this week sees the start of a brand new original. Bertie Covell stars as PD James Dalgleish, Thursday and Friday at 9. Next tonight, a major car crash will see the ambulance Code Red team pushed to their limits.
On the charge sheet of human history, few things create such an indelible stain as slavery.
The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse. Nothing.
Yet few histories are more important for us to understand.
It's power to know what happened to you in the past. Because if you don't know what happened to you in the past, you can't stop it from happening again.
In this series, many well-known faces with a direct and often surprising link to this 1,000-year story are embarking on journeys to different corners of the globe. They'll uncover the truth about their past and tell the story of the oppression and exploitation of one human being by another.
It beggars belief, really. How do you make that transition? How do you go through that trauma and that adversity?
With expert knowledge from across continents, their journeys will be complemented by descendants, celebrities, and historians to tell the bigger story of the enslaved peoples of the world.
The enslavement of Africans changed our language. It changed what we eat, what we wear, what we drink, and created a force that still divides us today.
Yet slavery also inspired resistance and rebellion. From a brave but doomed uprising in Jamaica.
I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm proud to be who I am, and I'm proud where I come from and who I come from.
To a long overdue reckoning in our own lifetime.
Black Lives Matter!
This is the 1,000-year story of how slavery stained our past and shaped the modern world. In this episode, we examine explosive protests from our recent past and how they shook the world.
With the kind of fervor that there is now, I think we're at an unstoppable place. I've never seen in my adult life the kind of activism that I see now.
In Bristol, historian David Olusoga explores the impact of history on this growing movement.
This is the convulsions that we're living through brought to bear on this statue.
Whilst in New York, descendant Kenneth B. Morris Jr. explores the pivotal role his ancestor Frederick Douglass played in the global fight for abolition.
Frederick Douglass would expect that his descendants continue that fight, to continue that struggle.
And Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, tells the story of how direct action in the UK changed the course of our history.
It wasn't just about jobs on the buses. That led to the Race Relations Equalities Act in the UK.
Last year, disbelief, anger, as well as the possibility of change were in the air. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the United States, people took to the streets.
The killing of George Floyd and other African Americans at the hands of police has protesters taking to the streets in cities from coast to coast.
Voicing their indignation that yet another Black American had been killed by a white police officer, it sparked a passionate protest movement across the globe.
Black Lives Matter didn't just happen in the States, it happened in the UK, it happened in Europe, Africa, all over the world.
It's no longer just black people shouting Black Lives Matter. Everyone's saying it.
George Floyd's murder brought American police brutality and institutional racism into sharp focus. For many, even for those living thousands of miles away, the violence and injustice were deeply shocking.
putting your knee on the neck of someone for 8 minutes and 45 seconds has nothing to do with policing. It's much, much more than that.
When I say Black Lives Matter, I'm asking you to accept it. Because for so long they haven't mattered, and they didn't matter. They could be sold, beaten, tortured, burned. You could do anything to them. So Black lives didn't matter.
Historian David Olusoga is more aware than most of the wealth which poured into Bristol from the slave trade. His work uncovering British history has taken him all over the world, but it's the city of Bristol that he today calls home.
I've lived in Bristol for about 20 years, and in that time, the city's been slowly, year by year, getting better, getting more willing to discuss its role in the Atlantic slave trade.
There's been a settlement inland from the Bristol Channel for over 1,000 years. But it wasn't until the 18th century when Bristol merchants could take full advantage of established trade networks that Bristol really started to boom.
Like hundreds of cities across Europe, it's got this history, its connections to slavery and the slave trade that have been unprocessed, that people have not wanted to acknowledge for decades.
2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd in the United States, Bristol also hit the headlines.
Protesters in Bristol have pulled down a statue of a slave trader during a day of otherwise largely peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
The pace of change, the pace at which these histories are just emerging into the present has suddenly accelerated. That one statue, that one story suddenly made Bristol the centre, the world centre of these debates about slavery, why it's been partly forgotten and why we need to remember
it. The statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston had been a source of controversy for many years. Born in Bristol in 1636, Edward Colston amassed a small fortune from the slave trade. In recent years, some in the city had called for an additional plaque to be added or for the statue to be removed entirely.
I can understand why somebody would want to take a statue down, but if we don't teach those statues, if we don't put them in museums, people are going to believe they never existed.
For me, I want those statues to remain, and I want the real truth put underneath. It should be lest we forget.
After the statue was recovered, it was put into storage until its future could be determined. But what should happen now to this most divisive statue? A potent symbol of slavery. After the statue of Edward Colston was pulled down in the summer of 2020, it was hidden away from view. After nearly a year of debate and controversy, historian David Olusoga has come to see the statue put on temporary display for the very first time. But it would no longer be standing tall.
Whenever you see a statue that's been taken off its pedestal, it looks diminished, looks less powerful, because a lot of the power comes from them being high up and looking down on you. 125 years it stood in the center of a city that just brushed under the carpet its involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. And then he is dumped into the harbor from which 2,000 slave trading expeditions set sail. You can see the scrapes and the scars from his journey across the streets of Bristol. This graffiti, it's just loaded with symbolism. I mean, the red on his hands is obviously a metaphor for the blood on his hands. And the scars are about the kind of battles that we're fighting and we're facing now. Edward Colston is now much more famous than he ever was in his lifetime. And what's made him famous was an event that took place 5,000 miles away, the murder of an African-American man outside a convenience store in Minneapolis.
Edward Colston himself never lived to see his reputation celebrated or condemned. And whilst his statue would be erected in Bristol, the city of his birth, it was London where Colston spent most of his working life.
We know that in his 12 years, Colston's involvement in the Royal Africa Company, that more than 80,000 Africans are transported into slavery by the company that he is working for, that he's a shareholder for, that he's partly for 2 years deputy governor of. And we know that around 19,000 of them died. And this statue was silent about them. They were invisible in this whole story. And that really, for me, was the problem with the statue. Not just that it told half-truths about a man, it said what he did with the money, and it didn't mention where the money came from. It was absolutely silent about the people who died and suffered and who were whipped and beaten and mutilated and punished in order to create this fortune.
Edward Colston gave away much of his wealth before his death in 1721. But that wasn't the end of the story. Over 100 years later, a 19th century cult had emerged among Bristol's elite who wanted to celebrate Colston's philanthropy.
What the statue of Edward Colston perfectly demonstrates is the fact that statues don't tell history. They're not designed to tell history, because the real history it tells is not of Edward Colston's life in the 17th century, but of Bristol in the late 19th century and the merchant elite who wanted to create a civic saint out of a slave trader to benefit their position and their dominance over the city. The statue was erected by men who knew that Colston was a slave trader. They just didn't care, because they could never imagine a moment in the future in which anyone would care about the tens of thousands of Africans that Colston was complicit in enslaving and killing. They couldn't imagine a time like the 21st century where the lives of those Africans would matter.
I don't think things will ever go back. The history is finally coming to the surface. And I think when things stop being secretive, then change comes about.
While 17th century slave traders such as Edward Colston channeled profits back to England, a new generation of Englishmen crossed the Atlantic to build wealth overseas, and one individual would leave a devastating legacy. Elias Ball was just 22 years old when he left his family in Devon for the newly formed English colony of Carolina. One of 13 original colonies founded in North America, the English established a settlement on a peninsula by the Ashley and Cooper Rivers, known as Charleston today.
The English were already involved in the transatlantic slave trade. This wasn't anything new, and they were looking for their opportunity to make their way into colonizing the Western Atlantic world. So Virginia, Barbados, and ultimately in South Carolina become very important.
North of Charleston, descendant and award-winning writer Edward Ball is recreating the journey made by his English ancestor, Elias Ball, when he started his new life in America.
The crop in South Carolina was rice, not cotton.
All of these grasses were rice fields at one time. There would be hundreds of people that up to their thighs in mud.
It was back-breaking work, and it was never-ending.
This was the factory that produced the wealth of the Southern American states.
There's a growing awareness of what the slave trade bequeathed to the descendants of people who were involved, and what it meant to the creation of wealth in Britain, what it meant to the creation of wealth in America.
The year 1698 marked the start of the Ball dynasty in South Carolina, when Elias Ball inherited a single plantation, Cumming Tea, from his father's half-brother.
We're at the main house of Cumming Tea Plantation. Elias Ball built this house about 1740 and lived here until his death, surrounded by his 100 enslaved workers. And many generations of the Balls lived here for the next 175 years. It was the hub of the hive. And now it's quiet, as it should be.
We have to understand our history, warts and all. But you have to fess up to that, own up to it, get into the detail of the hundreds of years in which it was constructed and why it was constructed.
Edward decided to study the records kept by successive generations of the Ball family, found today at the South Carolina Historical Society.
This book is pigskin-bound ledger. It chronicles buying and selling of people. Jenny, born and bought Hampshire. Who was born and who died? Paul, Blackjack, Will, Harry. Who ran away when they were recaptured?
Edward discovered that over the course of nearly 200 years, his family had owned more than 20 rice plantations and enslaved over 4,000 African Americans. And one name in particular would allow Edward to connect his English past with his American present.
Here it is. This is 1756 in July. I bought 4 boys and 2 girls. Sancho, 9 years old. Peter, ditto. Brutus, 7. Harriet, 6. Belinda, 10. Priscilla, 10. Like many, many descendants of slaveholders, I looked the other way. Because to look at the legacy of slavery in its face, this bloody heirloom, is a very hard assignment for anyone.
Facing up to his family history, Edward tracked down descendants of those enslaved on his family's estates. At the entrance to Charleston Harbor, he's meeting Tomalin Martin Polite, the 7th generation descendant of 10-year-old Priscilla.
As far as I know, we are the only family that has an unbroken paper trail to name the actual person who came from Sierra Leone to America as a slave.
People kidnapped from the so-called Rice Coast of West Africa weren't just stolen for the capacity of their bodies, but also for their skills and knowledge.
Because of the similar terrain of South Carolina to Sierra Leone, it was perfect for rice growing, and Sierra Leoneans had developed a very sought-after talent that South Carolinians wanted and needed to help cultivate their rice plantations.
The shipment of black Africans, the use of them as chattel and as goods, the wealth that was amassed across the world, is in the modern era unparalleled in its destructive force.
Like Tomalin's ancestor Priscilla, 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to the United States came through Charleston Harbor.
We are standing at Sullivan's Island, which is where the ship named the Hare brought Priscilla along with the rest of the captives. There were 110, 85 survived. They were taken to the pest houses to be inspected as if merchandise. And then the slaves were taken to be sold to Elias Ball, the Cumming Tea Plantation. Priscilla, she stayed there for 55 years, bore 10 children, and she died at the age of 65 on Cumming Tea Plantation.
How does that make you feel?
It makes me sad. It makes me proud, though, It's a very humbling experience as well. When you think of the issues that I face or that we face today, it makes it seem so minute compared to what she faced.
To look honestly at the slave past is like glancing into a wound in order to try to release the poisons which have been trapped, with the hope, the dim hope, that the wound might heal properly.
Finally, I think large sections of white society is beginning to ask themselves questions, whereas perhaps they didn't before. For some reason, white America is suddenly listening.
From the very start of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans had fought against slavery, rebelling and resisting on slave ships and on the plantations. But in the late 18th century, another group began to emerge, the abolitionists. And the writing of one campaigner, who had a huge impact in America, also brought his message to Britain.
This book made Frederick Douglass arguably the most famous black person in the world, an extraordinarily dangerous position to be in, because Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave.
The world of slavery was one of constant conflict and rebellion. But in the late 18th century, a political movement emerged committed to abolition. And one of the most powerful tools in its arsenal was the publication of first-hand accounts by people who had themselves been enslaved.
On a signal given, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make a choice of that parcel they like. In this manner, without scruple, are relations and friends separated. Most of them never to see each other again.
Accounts such as these helped turn British public opinion before slavery was abolished in 1833. But in America, the road towards abolition was infinitely longer and more complex. And one African-American abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, would do more than most to turn the tide of history.
Frederick Douglass was met with all forms of segregation and racism, and yet managed to rise above that. How so? By focusing on liberating his brothers and sisters.
Born into slavery in Maryland around 1818, Frederick Douglass was separated from his mother as a young child.
There are accounts where people talk about children being ripped out of people's hands and sold away at 2 months old. There's the physical abuse, but then there's the mental abuse.
Frederick Douglass was separated from his mother at a very young age. And then he was made to live with his grandmother. And again, another separation.
Douglass was moved from one plantation to the next and leased to several farmers, including Edward Covey, a particularly brutal slave breaker. Then in 1838, when only 20 years old, Douglass escaped and headed to the free states of the North. Once settled in Massachusetts, Douglass became an agent for abolitionist societies, meeting key figures who encouraged him to share his story. And in 1845, he published an autobiography in which he took the bold move to name his legal owner.
The publication of his autobiography is a political act. He's ready to lose what he acquired for the sake of telling that story and sharing that story.
The book was an instant success, but it catapulted Frederick Douglass to a dangerous level of fame for someone who was still the legal property of another. Without delay, in the August of 1845, Douglass bid farewell to his wife and 4 children and boarded a ship bound for Britain. Historian David Olusoga has travelled to Tyneside, where he grew up, to tell the story of a British family with whom Frederick Douglass enjoyed an enduring transatlantic friendship.
This book made Frederick Douglass arguably the most famous black person in the world. But to be famous, to be someone whose image was known to thousands of people, that was an extraordinarily dangerous position for Douglass to be in, because in the 1840s he was still an escaped slave. He was still legally the property of the slave owner, Thomas Auld. And so Douglass did what many African Americans did in that time, which was he came to Britain.
By the time Frederick Douglass arrived in Britain in 1845, slavery had already been abolished, but that wasn't the end of the British anti-slavery movement.
There was a whole network of abolitionists who are now anti-slavery campaigners, who saw it as the mission of Victorian Britain to fight against slavery everywhere in the world, and particularly in the United States. And Douglass was able to tap into that network. Every city he went to, he would be welcomed, and he would lodge at the houses of anti-slavery activists. And he traveled around Britain in the time he was here, almost 2 years, and spoke hundreds of times. And one of the places that he came was to Newcastle.
One prominent group of anti-slavery activists were the Quakers, the first religious group on either side of the Atlantic to come out against slavery.
This house was home to a family called the Richardsons. Ellen, her sister Anna, and her husband Henry. They were radical Quakers. They'd been involved in the campaigns to end slavery in the British Empire, and in the 1840s, it was in this house that Frederick Douglass stayed while he was in Newcastle. Anna and Ellen began the process through meetings and writing letters of purchasing the freedom, purchasing the manumission papers for Frederick Douglass.
However, the transaction arranged to purchase Douglass's freedom was, for some, deeply problematic. Douglass and the Richardsons were immediately criticized.
Douglass's freedom is to be purchased through a legal contract of sale, and the argument was made that to accept a transaction is to accept that Douglass was chattel, that he was something that could be bought and sold. One of the people who makes this argument is the abolitionist Henry Clark Wright, and he wrote a letter to Frederick Douglass, and that letter, along with Frederick Douglass's response to it, was published in this newspaper, The Liberator, the great American abolitionist newspaper. This is from January 1847. Dear Frederick, that certificate for your freedom, that bill of sale for your body and your soul from that villain, Thomas Auld, who dared to claim you as chattel and set a price on you, I wish you would not touch it. Douglass responds by stating some pretty stark and painful facts. He says, I am in England, my family are in the United States. My sphere of usefulness, where he can be most effective in fighting slavery, is in the United States. But I am legally the property of Thomas Auld, and if I go to the United States, Thomas Auld, aided by the American government, can seize, bind, and fetter me, and drag me from my family, and feed his cruel revenge upon me, and doom me to unending slavery. And Douglass rejects this idea that by purchasing his freedom from Thomas Auld, that he is accepting the idea of property in men. He says that it is almost like giving money to an armed robber. You're not accepting the morality or the legality of being mugged or being robbed at gunpoint when you hand your money over.
Douglass returned to the United States in 1847, but he never forgot his time in Britain or his friends in Newcastle.
In this letter, Douglass describes his feelings to Anna and to Britain. He says, all England is dear to me, and though long in her borders and absent from home and anxious to be at home, I left with the heaviest of heart that words cannot express. But, he says, I now have my manumission papers. These are the papers that prove that legally he is no longer enslaved. There is nothing that will sting the Americans more than the fact that I landed on your shores a slave and came back a free man.
Upon his return to America, he was reunited with his family in upstate New York, where he began publishing his first abolitionist newspaper and where he continued the American fight for the abolition of slavery.
Whereas in England, the horrors and torture in the Caribbean were kept out of sight of the British public, America was born in slavery. I think that many people got addicted to that power. The southern states in particular, that's why they went to war, right?
The South wasn't just a society that had slaves, it was a slave society. And what that meant was every part of Southern society is built around an enslaved labor system.
The northern and southern states had disagreed for decades on the powers of federal government and Western expansion. And with the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860, tensions soon came to a head.
Lincoln runs on a platform to stop the spread of slavery into the new states out west. The southern states say if we can't expand, then maybe slavery will die.
Within months of President Lincoln's election victory, 7 southern states broke away from the Union. And when the incoming Lincoln administration refused to recognize their legitimacy, Confederate forces opened fire.
The Civil War is really a cauldron where a variety of issues, political issues, notions of citizenship, all come together. But you've got to understand that African Americans have always demanded citizenship.
And Frederick Douglass was one such campaigner. Kenneth B. Morris Jr. is the 3-times great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. Kenneth was inspired to continue his ancestors' legacy when he read an article in National Geographic magazine.
I really spent most of my life taking this lineage for granted, and it wasn't until I read that National Geographic magazine article with the headline, 21st Century Slaves, that I started to feel connected to this lineage.
Today, Kenneth runs a charity seeking to end human trafficking and modern-day slavery. But in the 19th century, his ancestor played a key role in the abolitionist movement. Kenneth has traveled to New York to meet Professor Maurice Wallace and learn more about the unique role Frederick Douglass played in the American Civil War.
What do you think Frederick Douglass's ambitions were during the war?
So I think he understood that the abolition of slavery once and for all depended upon Union victory. And he wanted nothing more than for Lincoln to get behind that cause. And there were at least a couple of meetings with Lincoln. And Douglass was a little surprised at just how humane Lincoln was. But I also think that Lincoln was a little surprised at just how shrewd Douglass was.
In the first year of the Civil War, the services of African-American soldiers were denied by the federal government.
It really wasn't until the Union Army was suffering many losses. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in late 1862, beginning in 1863, that they suddenly begin to say, we'll take black soldiers. But there was a great deal of hesitancy.
For Douglass, this was the turning point he had been waiting for.
Why do you think my great ancestor was so adamant about recruiting black soldiers to the cause?
He imagined that black soldiers would fight with even greater convictions than their white peers for their own people's liberty, their own liberty in many cases. I think, too, that he was also persuaded that black men who enlisted in the war could demonstrate black people's deservedness of American citizenship.
And Douglass himself became a recruiter for the Massachusetts 54th.
I see some images, Frederick Douglass's sons, am I correct, as enlistees in the Civil War.
Yeah, Douglass was so committed to the cause that his sons were his first recruits. This is Charles is my great-great-grandfather, and then this would be my great-great-great-uncle Lewis. Charles, in particular, was the first black man in New York to enlist. Charles became ill when they were training, and he never fought with the Massachusetts 54th, but Lewis fought in the Battle of Fort Wagner and Morris Island. Cause of abolition was so important to these two men that they would be willing to die and give up their freedom. I'm really proud of that, because I wonder, you know, if I would have had that same commitment, you know, that they had.
Douglas's sons were born free, but many of the 200,000 African Americans who fought on the side of the Union had themselves been enslaved. And 8 months after Union victory in 1865, slavery was finally abolished. 4 million African Americans began their lives as free people, yet the terrible legacy of slavery, racism, and white supremacy would continue to divide America for generations to come.
Frederick Douglass said, "Without struggle, there is no progress." And this country is undergoing a mighty struggle right now. And I think that he would still be out there agitating, speaking truth to power, and he would expect that his descendants continue that fight, continue that struggle.
Nearly 60 years before the murder of George Floyd shook the world, another struggle sent shockwaves through Britain and America. The fight for civil rights would change the course of world history.
In America, and certainly in the American South, the past is never really past. History is not dead. It's alive, and it's very much alive in the lives of black Americans today.
For Americans, in the North and South, the abolition of slavery heralded the start of a new era. African Americans served in government positions and became members of Congress. But in 1877, a decade of progress came to an abrupt end when the last remaining federal troops were withdrawn from the South.
Everything that we fought for was rolled back. It was all rolled back.
Segregation, intimidation, and racial violence took hold in America's Deep South.
Ending slavery on the books is one thing, but once that happens, what's next? Barriers were placed in the way, obstacles were placed in the way. And so by the time you have a Rosa Parks, black people had gained this mentality of no more.
After civil rights campaigner Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, public attention around the globe was drawn to the injustice of segregation.
Rosa Parks was tired of the oppression, the exploitation, being treated in an inhumane way.
The injustice caught the attention of many, including a young Martin Luther King Jr.
Daddy taught me that we will triumph. Not over people, but over injustice and over hate.
Let all of us be calm and reasonable. We can integrate the buses Montgomery with no difficulty.
During the Montgomery bus protest is when he started articulating this as nonviolence.
In December 1955, 40,000 African-American passengers boycotted the buses. 13 months later, the US Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's buses should be desegregated. The Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated that grassroots activism could lead to real and sustained change. And its success rippled across the world.
The legacy of slavery, racism, people are still struggling to fight against a system. I mean, it's huge.
Events in America were closely followed by African Caribbean migrants who arrived in Britain after the Second World War.
Think about the Windrush generation. We were part of the British Empire. So you kind of go, we could go to any of these other countries, but we chose to come to Britain.
My mother was one of the Windrush generation. There was this desperation to fit in. to give your children very British-sounding names.
But the migrants did not receive the warm welcome they had expected.
You know, there were signs on doors saying, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs.
And black communities in London and Nottingham were attacked by white youths. By the 1960s, around 3,000 African Caribbean men, women, and children had settled in Bristol. Among them, the Jamaican-born father of Bristol's current mayor, Marvin Rees.
The hostility towards people with black and brown skin coming into the UK was something that took people by surprise. And they would be abused, they'd be physically attacked. Work would have been tough to find.
Until the 1960s, there were no laws to prevent racial discrimination in Britain, and civil protest emerged once again.
There was an overt policy of not employing black people, Asian people on Bristol's buses. People were being absolutely excluded from economic opportunity.
The point is that whilst we can obtain white labour in this city, we intend to go on engaging white labour rather than coloured labour.
And some white bus conductresses didn't want to work with black male drivers.
It's not very nice for a woman to be out till 12:30 at night with a coloured man, is it? Not a white woman.
Inspired by the success of protests in America, civil rights campaigners in Bristol, led by youth officer Paul Stevenson, organised a campaign to boycott the buses. Just 4 months later, the Bristol Omnibus Company lifted its colour bar.
I think this is going to be welcomed by coloured people all over Bristol and many Bristolians who came in and gave us their sympathy.
Well, the bus boycott, I think, was of profound importance, not just in Bristol, but across the country. And interestingly, the day of success was the same day as I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King, 1963.
3 weeks later, Bristol Omnibus Company had hired its first non-white bus conductor, Ragbir Singh.
People began to get opportunity, but it wasn't just about jobs on the buses, because that led to the first raft of Equalities Act in the UK as well.
In 1965, the Race Relations Act was the first piece of legislation to prohibit racial discrimination in Britain.
And when I look at my journey, being the first African heritage mayor of any British city, I have to trace my own journey back to the fights and the efforts that happened before I was born. And again, Bristol finds itself in this spot. We have the BLM rally, the statue gets pulled down, the world looks to Bristol, and we end up contributing to the shaping of the way the world thinks about race inequality.
Britain's attempts to draw a veil over those 2 centuries as a slave trading and a slave owning power just haven't worked. This history is re-emerging into the 21st century because it was never acknowledged in the 19th and the 20th century.
It was the English who, in their early Caribbean colonies, first fully institutionalized and codified racism.
White supremacy is an English invention that was franchised to several different countries.
For the next 200 years, slavery was to have a huge impact around the globe.
The slave system created the ruins that we're still navigating. This enormous global system changed the world, and it changed us in the process.
And that history has left a bitter legacy that we're still grappling with today.
When you look at George Floyd's death and the worldwide movement which resulted, you realize that there are people today who will make sure that we do not ignore history.
We're told constantly, Black Lives Matter, that's about America, it's got nothing to do with Britain. It's about what we haven't been told, what we don't have the opportunity of learning.
I'm not sure if it's possible to be a black man or woman in the USA, in Britain, in Africa, and not be angry, knowing what we do about our history, and knowing what we face in the present.
Back with a brand new mystery to solve, our much talked about crime drama Dalgleish continues with a 2-part investigation Thursday and Friday at 9. A disturbing call out for the team next who were dispatched to a churchyard in ambulance code red.